Yeah, I remember that sound.
Okay, well, let's get started. It's
Okay.
three. And this can be, I know y'all are going to just like have a cow when I say this. This can be literally a 3-hour class. That's what it is when I used to teach it, but I am going to talk fast. But I need y'all to interrupt me when you need to have a question. It's like, I don't understand that, or let's go through that. Interrupt me, or I can just, or write something in the chat and I can check at the end of each page to see if we've got something going on. So the way I set this class up is that I did a mock purchase contract and it's sitting in .loop. So we are going to go to .loop and it should be right there. So we're going to start here with our mock purchase contract. First thing, I would never write a purchase contract like this. I did this just because I've got stars and asterisks and circles and everything else that were going to be too hard to get on. So I just wrote it out. When I get a handwritten purchase contract, I'm always like, gotcha. So, okay, so first of all, this is a CBA contract. So many agents call it a CBR contract. It is not. It is the Columbus Bar Association. It is written by attorneys. This paragraph up here is very important. Can you see me when I do that little thing with my arrow?
Yes.
Awesome. So if anything's different from the standard CBA contract that we have in front of us, we're using that contract. But if you would use a contract by Coldwell Banker, HER, or some other company, and they did something that was different from the standard CBA contract, it will be in a larger font in bold. So it sticks out. So you might want to look for that. For example, in the Coldwell Banker contract, they do a little bit differently with their earnest money. So that's something that you would want to review so that when you're going through the contract with your buyers or your sellers, that you would be able to understand what that is. It's just a clue. Okay, so obviously I've starred this and it's at the top of our contract. It is recommended that all parties be represented by a realtor and an attorney. So Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, this is our time that if you want an attorney to review this before we send it, we have an attorney review, but that's usually if we get into trouble and if an attorney is welcomed. I think a lot of agents are fearful of having an attorney that they're going to pick it apart, but that's not the case. They are here to help us. So we've got the date, whatever your date is, and we're going to put the Franklin County. We're going to fill in whatever the parcel number is. I suggest taking the parcel number from the parcel page from the auditor site. Do not take it from the MLS. If it was wrong on the MLS, which typically it's not going to be, but you could put a wrong number in if you didn't have it auto-populate from the tax records. So we always want to make sure that you've got that straight from the auditor's page. You're going to put in the address. You do not have to put being a single family home situated on 1.5 acres and blah, 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 blah. An attorney told me if you've got the parcel number and you've got the street address, you're good to go. We're going to write out the address in the number form, numeric form, and then we're going to spell it out. If there is a difference between a number and the written one, the legal one would take the written one. So always make sure those match. Additional terms and conditions. The CBA contract gives us a very small spot here because they don't want us to add a bunch of additional terms and conditions. But guess what? Sometimes we have to. We may have a home to sell. We may have conditional of acceptance of a wife or a husband. There could be 100 things that it could be conditioned on. So if there are more than what can fit here, as far as your conditions go, then we're going to go and just say, see attached page with additional terms and conditions as an integral part of this contract. And you're going to direct them to that and say, hey, look for that page. It's here. Next paragraph, we've got the attorney approval clause. Typically, it's 5 days. You could put 7, but I think 5 is a good number. This is one of the paragraphs that if this provision is not applicable or applicable and number of days is not inserted, that you don't get it. So the other ones, if we leave them blank, it defaults to you get 2 days, you get 5 days, you get whatever the days are that it's listed in the paragraph. But this is one that it's not applicable. So if you don't put a number in there, this paragraph number 2 you don't get to take advantage of it. And it basically is saying that you're going to send it to an attorney to see if they disapprove of the contract. This isn't for the attorney to change terms or the price. It would strictly be if there was a condition or a paragraph that they felt needed to be added to the purchase contract. So once that's sent, they have 3 calendar days after the delivery there to make sure that it's something that the other party wants to. And the party that is sending this can also can waive this if they've decided they don't want to use this paragraph. So I have earnest money deposit underlined here, and I've done that on every place it shows up. And I think there's about 7 times in our purchase contract where it says, if the contract is terminated, the earnest money deposit shall be returned to the buyer. That's a yes and no statement. Yes, they can get it back, but they have to do some different things to get it. So I don't want you to assume that just because it says if the contract is terminated, the earnest money deposit shall be returned. And when we get to that contract paragraph, which is number 12, this is going to make sense. I just want to point it out to you guys that this is said over and over and over in this contract. Okay, number 3, financing. We're going to initial in the box if your buyers are buying with cash, okay? Now, the buyer shall deliver to the seller or the seller's broker within 5 calendar days after the date of the acceptance the following letter, which is going to be our sufficient funds letter. Now, I have this circled right here because it says buyer shall deliver to the seller. Now, 9 times out of 10, the buyer is not going to deliver that. Chances are you are, okay? So it says the buyer's going to deliver under the financing, the buyer's going to deliver the commitment letter, and it states in this purchase contract that the buyer shall deliver the request to remedy. So we have a form. Years ago, let me start off with a little story. Years ago, we had an agent in our office who had a big house listed, and the wife went in with the decorator right before the closing, and the decorator said, "Oh my goodness, this is all wrong for you." The wife goes home to the husband and says, "I don't want this house." And the husband says, "No problem. I think we can wiggle out because we haven't received our loan commitment yet." So he went back to his agent, and the agent said, "Oh, yeah, I got a copy of that loan commitment. You did receive it." And I went ahead and forwarded it on to the other agent. That agent got in trouble because the buyer said, it says that the buyer shall deliver to the seller or the seller's broker. So the office spoke with an attorney, and we put together a buyer consent and disclosure. And this is a disclosure. It's an optional form that you guys can use. And it basically says everything that we do as realtors that we're asked to do in the purchase contract, and we're getting permission from either the buyer or the seller to do so. So in that case, it was, which one is it? Provide the buyer with a notice of deposit, provide the seller with the buyer's objection to the title commitment. Here's the one about the written request of remedy, demand for financing, the loan commitment letter. So if you feel like that might be an issue, this is a great form to use. It also says, hey, it's recommended that all parties contact an attorney. So it's kind of a CYA, and it goes against the purchase contract, saying that the buyer's going to do things that we typically do on their behalf. Any questions on that? Because we're going to see that 2 other places.
I think that's awesome. I did not know that that existed.
Most people do not know that that existed.
That's awesome.
I tell you, it was a nasty little deal, and the agent got sued, and he really didn't have a leg to stand on. It all worked out in the end, but it was a little scary. So anyway. So we're going to get
question, Tracy, while we're talking about that. if we have a buyer's exclusive, does that cover, does somewhere in there cover that we are representative of the buyer or
I doubt
no?
it. Because
When
I
it,
feel like we use on our team, we have like it's a loyalty agreement. I know doesn't cover that, but you could make your own loyalty agreement or add it into the one, like just like a
yeah,
handwritten one onto the buyer exclusive that the board, gives us to use.
yes. Okay,
Okay.
thank you.
Sure. So we're going to have that sufficient letter, and the seller may terminate this contract paragraph to 3.3. 3.3 is a second chance. So we're basically going to give the buyer a second chance on a couple different things, earnest money and financing, if they don't come through within the days that we have stated. And we're going to get to that in just a minute. Okay. So now, so this one, 3.2 or 3.1 is I'm going to buy cash. 3.2 is I'm going to buy or obtain a loan. So this one's obtaining financing. And we've got two ways that we're going to give it to them. We either have it. So once again, buyer has delivered. No, chances are you and I have delivered. Or buyer shall deliver within X amount of days. Now this one is a 2, so that it defaults to 2, but I think it's a very nice courtesy to go ahead and write a 2 in there, because we as realtors just look for those blanks. So now we have 2 days saying that we're going to get a credit report that's been reviewed. The buyer is pre-qualified to obtain a loan. And if the buyer does not deliver the pre-qualified, once again, here's his second chance to get that to the seller's agent within 3 days after he's missed this initial 2 days. Okay, make sense? And make sure you're working with a lender that understands that in his report, his lender letter, it needs to say that the buyer's credit report has been reviewed. It needs to say that. It needs to state that. If you get a wishy-washy one, it may not hold up for if you're in a dual offer situation and that somebody's got an excellent pre-qualification letter and yours is just so-so. All right. So now we've got a pre-qualification letter that just says, hey, it looks good to go. But now we're going to have to say, we've got a formal loan application going on. So now we say, Mr. Buyer, you have 5 days, or if it's blank, they have 7 from the date of the acceptance of this contract to make a formal loan application. We're going to write in, is it conventional, FHA, VA, USDA? And then we're going to inform the sellers in writing of the identity of the lender. Now we've got a form for that. So I think a lot of people just assume that when I send a pre-qualification letter, that actually suffices as my identification of the lender. Not so much. It's about the same, but we actually have a form that's going to, I hope I put that in here. I'm sure I did. No. Maybe I didn't. I can't believe I didn't. Well, I can show it to you guys. It basically says that it just identifies the lender and it says that they show intent, doggone it. They have the intent to go forward with the purchase. But that's a different letter than your pre-qualification letter. They also had to notify the lender the buyer's intent. Well, the seller has to, or the lender is going to notify of the buyer's intent to proceed with the application. So if the buyer does not, once again, they get a second chance in 3.3 within those 5 days. So the buyer shall provide information and documentation. So you're basically saying, hey, Mr. Lender or Mr. Buyer, don't go out and buy a boat or don't go out and, screw up your mortgage and your credit so that you can't get a loan. We want to make sure that if any, the lender notifies the buyer in writing that they will not be able to provide the financing in terms and the conditions stated in the loan application. The buyer may terminate this contract by delivering a copy of the lender's written notification to the seller or the seller's broker within 3 days of following, those are calendar days, following the buyer's receipt thereof. Attorneys call this the cruise ship paragraph, meaning this is one of those paragraphs that when the buyer has to know that they have to be somewhat within reach, that if they get this notification, they have 3 days to say, hey, I have notification that I've been denied of my loan. And they need to send that on so that they can get their earnest money back. Okay. So if I'm on a cruise and I have no communication, I may not see that my loan didn't get approved. So just remember that when you have those conversations with your buyer, that he needs to know that he's got 3 days when he gets that denial that he couldn't get the loan to get that to you that you can forward on. Failure of the buyer to deliver the lender's written notification within 3 days following the receipt thereof constitutes a waiver of the buyer's right to terminate. So if he's on the cruise ship and he gets the denial and he doesn't know to send it, well, now he's not out of the contract and he could lose his earnest money. So that's an important paragraph. Any questions on that? Okay. So now our next step, we've got the pre-qual, we've got the loan app. Now it's the actual loan commitment. And a loan commitment is the underwriter has said, you're clear, you're good to go. There's nothing stopping this train. We've done the appraisal, we've done everything. We're good. You have a commitment. Sometimes we need to be careful when we get a loan commitment that says, hey, you know, you've got a loan commitment, and then you read the 5th page and it says, however, it's contingent on the appraisal. It's contingent on a review of a pay stub. Just make sure you really have the underwriter's blessing and a full loan commitment. Typically it's about 30 days, but you want to make sure that coincides with the closing date. And what I mean by that is, right now, we're having lots of fast closings to try and get the deal and a multiple offer. So if I'm going to have a 28-day closing and I write in 30 for the loan commitment, well, that doesn't make sense. And it would make me look very unprofessional that I didn't write like 27 days for the loan commitment if I had 28 days to close. Okay? Yep.
Do you typically write in 3 days, whatever the number of days is, 3 days prior to your closing date because of TRID?
I try and do 3 or as many as humanly possible close to that time, but yeah. Yes, 3 would be perfect.
Yeah. Okay.
The loan commitment shall state that the lender will provide financing for the purchase of the property, subject to conditions and qualifications imposed by the lender's discretion. So if at the expiration of the loan commitment period, at the end of those 30 days, and that buyer has not delivered that loan commitment to the seller, the seller can terminate this contract, but they got to go through the second chance. So we're almost there. 3.2D, our appraisal contingency. If the property is appraised for loan purposes. So guys, if you're writing a cash offer, some cash buyers still want to have an appraisal. That's fine. But this paragraph says that it's for a loan purpose. So if you want to have an appraisal with a cash deal, you must write that in under additional terms and conditions. Okay? That's a big little hole that people, will slip through.
Do we have a clause for that in .loop?
We don't.
Okay.
I think it would just basically be, this home is contingent on, or the sale is contingent on home appraising at or above final agreed purchase price. And you just write that in because the agent on the sell side would know that paragraph 3.2D doesn't apply if it's a cash deal. The buyer shall have the right to terminate this contract. Written notice to the seller or the seller's broker. Once again, there it goes, delivered within 5 days. So if the home doesn't appraise, then we've got 5 days from the day they received that copy in order to have a couple things happen. The seller could go down, the buyer could go up, the buyer and seller could meet in the middle, or it could terminate. but it doesn't mean that you can't negotiate, but we have 5 days to negotiate on that appraisal amount. Once again, upon delivery, the earnest money will be returned to the buyer. Maybe, maybe not. We'll get there. Failure of the buyer to deliver the written notice of termination within 5 calendar days of the receipt of the appraisal constitutes the buyer's right to terminate pursuant to this paragraph. So that's very important that we take note of those 5 days. Okay? Here we are on the second chance paragraph, and this paragraph is a little confusing. So basically it says that if the seller doesn't receive notification on paragraphs 3.1, 3.2a, 3.2b, and c, those are all the ones, the financing evidence that we were talking about earlier, the seller may at any time until 7 days before the closing date notify the buyer and the broker in writing that the seller has not received the evidence. Okay, so it's 7 days before my closing. I still don't have the loan application. Well, you probably would know before 7 days, but they're giving this amount of time. And it says here that seller has not received the required financing evidence specifying which type of financing. So that's our saying, hey, it's coming from Wells Fargo. It's overdue, a demand for financing evidence. If seller receives the required financing evidence within 3 days after the delivery of the demand for financing, so we send it, 3 days go by and I still haven't received it, or I'm sorry, if they do receive it, the parties shall proceed with the transaction. If they do not receive it within the 3 calendar days of delivery after the little letter goes, then the seller at any time thereafter until the financing evidence has been received can terminate. So I don't get it as, I don't send it as the buyer. Mr. Seller sends the demand for financing. If 3 days go by and I do get it, great. We're on the right track, we're gonna close. But if I don't get it, then the seller can elect to terminate the contract up until the time they do get it. Now, once they send it, so let's just say I dragged my feet, I didn't terminate the contract, I had a backup offer and I was watching those days, but somehow I let it go 4 days. If the 4th day and I hadn't sent a notice of termination and the buyer did send the demand letter, then we would still be in contract. So as a seller's agent, you need to be on top of that if you have a backup offer and you haven't received one of the demand for financings letters. Confused?
It's a little confusing. Tracy, day 1 starts the day after receipt, correct?
Right. So I go into contract on the 1st of June. Day 1 is June 2nd.
And that is the same for everything else when we're counting days for the rest of the contract.
Great point, and absolutely. And one of the things that I would strongly suggest is use the transaction timeline and send it to the other agent and say, these are the dates that I'm going by. And if you don't agree, then you need to let me know. So that we know from the very beginning, we're all on the same page as far as what is due when. Keep that page with you, highlight it, put it on a chalkboard in front of you on your desk, do something, but it is our fiduciary responsibility to watch those dates like a hawk. Failure of the seller in a timely deliver the written demand for financing constitutes a waiver of the seller's right to terminate pursuant to this provision. So we have duties on both sides of the table on this particular paragraph.
Quick question, the transaction timeline you're talking about, is that something that's in print somewhere that is like a checklist for us?
It sure
I'm
is.
new, so I'm still barely treading water, so.
So I did put that one in there.
All right, so that's not, is that in DocuSign also, do you know?
Oh, I'm sure it is.
Okay.
Yeah,
So it's not a transaction timeline?
yeah, transaction
Okay.
timeline. Yes.
Perfect. All right, thank you.
Okay, we are at 3.4. Okay, so here we are. So now we're at taxes and assessment. This is in bold print because yes, Mr. Buyer, your taxes are going to go up. It says that for the premise of the current year may change, they're going to go up as a result of the sale and the tax rate and valuation. Buyer and seller understand that real estate valuations may be subject to retroactive change by government authority. So the seller is in charge of all of these little things, all delinquent taxes, penalties, interest, all assessments, which would be a lien, all agricultural use tax recoupment. We call that a CAUV. So if Mr. Seller has a farm and he's either raising $2,000 towards crops or $2,000 towards livestock, not to include horses, they get a break on their taxes from the government. The government saying, thank you for giving back to the world. We're going to give you a break on your taxes. Now, if Mr. Buyer comes in and buys that property where Mr. Seller is getting a CAUV, Mr. Seller has to pay back his savings for 3 years. Now, a lot of people don't think that's quite fair. And this is one of those paragraphs that you'll see in a purchase contract where it may say, hey, Mr. Buyer Mr. Buyer wants to use the farm to hunt. He doesn't want to raise crops on it anymore. So why are we being penalized because we don't want to use it to raise crops? You're going to see that in real estate purchase contracts where this amount, these 3 years of savings can be negotiated, okay? Has anybody seen that happen on purchase contracts that you've written? Okay.
I just appreciate the explanation of what CAUV is because I never knew what that was.
That's what that is. So yeah, so it's and you'll see that a lot in Marysville and properties, and it's good to get a CAUV because you can save on your taxes. But you just have to know the next person buying your property, if they're not going to use it for crops or for livestock, then the seller has to pay back 3 years of savings.
What does that acronym stand for again?
I knew you were going to ask me that, and I got the one clue. Somebody Google that and then put it in our chat box.
Okay.
I'll look it up. I don't know. Agricultural, I don't know.
I'll look it up. Yeah, we would be more likely to see that, like, of course, farmland like Marysville or Bell Fountain or something. So our normal contract here in Dublin, Ohio, no. But I'm going to look it up right now. Okay.
Thank you. I did look up Clue Report because that's one I never remember either. We'll get there in a minute. So our taxes are based on a 365-day a year proration. So I always draw this little thing right here for my buyers and my sellers because sellers don't understand that they're going to say, no, I've paid my taxes. And you're going to say, yes, Mr. Seller, you know what? We're going to close on your property on April 30th. And you did pay on your taxes in January. But what you paid in January was for January of 2019. So the next bill that comes out when now the new owners live in your house, they're going to get a bill for January for $1,500. Then they're going to get a bill, in June for $1,500. Then in January of 2020, they're going to get a bill for these days, which would be 121 days at the proration rate. So if they would owe, the sellers are going to owe $1,500 for this time period right here, and then 121 days. And if we take 3,000 divided by 365, it's $8.22 a day in taxes times those 120 days. They'd pay $994 and the $1,500 in a credit. It's not until June of 2021 that the new owners actually get the bill for their property where they are currently residing. So buyers and sellers, that's something that we need to learn because if it would close here, now if it would close here, there'd be only like about 6 months in arrear, but something that closes like in the mid-year, the sellers are going to owe almost a full amount of taxes. Make sense? Good. I see shaking heads. Okay. Let's jump up here to, oh, one other thing I want to put in here. These adjustments shall be final except for the following. Who knows what we might put in there? Well,
Like when the taxes are being reassessed.
Could be, but more likely it's going to be a tax proration clause. So if I bought a home that was either a lot where the taxes are very low, or if I bought a home, like one time I had buyers and they bought a house on Mohawk in German Village, and they paid about $520,000 for the house. Now the the sellers had bought the house for $130,000 and literally gutted it. So the taxes that were on record were based they were like $3,000. So what happened was we had to put a tax proration clause, which is one of our templates in our clauses, that says, hey, if the amount of the house has changed drastically, which it had, so the taxes went from $3,000 to about $15,000, and Mr. Buyer was only going to bring to closing about $2,000 of back taxes, but my sellers owned the house. I'm sorry, my sellers got the bill when that house was reassessed for $15,000, but it was during the time that the sellers had owned the house. So it's a way to make it fair that Mr. Seller, let's just use this example right here. Mr. Seller, you know what, you own the house here, you bought it there, and you did all these wonderful renovations. Now I'm getting the bill right now in here, and it went from $1,500 to about $7,500. But that was during the time that you owned the house. So you need to send a letter, and basically the letter says, hey, when I get the tax bill, because we don't know when they're going to get the tax bill. It could be a month after closing, it could be 2 months. But if it's something that large, usually the county auditor and the schools are very excited to get that new sale of $500,000, and they go out and they drive by and they reassess that house. So if that bill came to my new buyers in June of 2020 and it had been reassessed, those taxes would have changed from $1,500 and $1,500 to $7,500 and $7,500, and we would have only received a small pittance back for what the bill really was. And so the letter says, hey, Mr. Seller, you agree that when we get the tax bill, we don't know what it's going to be, that you'll pay the difference in what you gave me, the $1,594, and what the taxes actually are. That's huge. If you've got to make sure that if you're selling a home that is a home that's been flipped, like by a lot, not $20,000, $30,000, but I'm talking like 100, lots of money, $100,000. Or if it's the taxes are on a lot and now they've put a $500,000 house on it. Now, like companies like Westport and Ryan and the tract home builders, they will not do this. I always try just to prove to my buyers that I'm trying for them. But most of the time that won't happen. If it's a custom home builder, they will most likely say, yep, I own the house during the time that it was just a lot and I pay taxes on that. So that's just something that if you get in trouble, come to Troy, come to me, come to, your team lead and Joan and talk to us about that, because that gets confusing. Any questions on that?
Nope. That's good.
Tracy?
Yep.
Okay, I did look up oh shoot, where did it go? The CAUV, the current agricultural use value.
Gotcha.
Thank you, Joan.
You're welcome. My contribution.
Okay, community development charge. So we have a list of these in our .loop templates, and it basically just says like there's a lot of communities that have a special assessment. This is not a tax. It's not included in their taxes. It's something on top of their taxes, and you can look at that on the auditor site. So it got started in 1990 when New Albany came to town, and everybody in the little village of New Albany did not want all the building and the sewers and the schools. So they said, tell you what, if you've lived here before 1990, we're not going to charge you. But any new homes that are going in, they're going to have a special assessment that they're going to pay for the roads, and they're going to pay for the new sewer systems, and they're going to pay for all of this special, assessments that's going to happen. And it worked like a charm. So since it worked so well, most all new developments have it. So like a lot of the homes in Powell and Gulf Village and north of Scioto Reserve and Hayden Road Crossing, the Pinnacle, what are some of the other ones? Oh, Jerome Village. So those are all listed, and we have to make sure that we fill in those blanks and make sure that our buyers are aware that there is a community development charge. And I could show you right now, we could pop into MLS right now, go into New Albany, and they'll say, no special assessment. And then I could show you that there is. So that's our responsibility to say, yeah, you've got a special assessment. And if you're not sure, just check the auditor's page, and it has an SA for special assessment that's on top of your taxes. Now, I've seen a lot of listing agents, and they roll that number into the taxes, which is the dumbest thing I can even imagine. So if I'm a New Albany house, let's just say I'm $500,000 house, I've got $10,000 worth of taxes. The last thing I want to do is make my taxes look larger than they are. So I would list it, I'd put $10,000, and then the question on our MLS sheet is special assessment, yes or no. It doesn't say how much or anything. That's for the buyer's agent to go figure out, okay? But as a listing agent, just make sure you say, yes, I have them. You go figure out what it is, but don't add it to your taxes. Did that make sense?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So the seller has to warrant no improvements or services have been made, which might be, hey, we have a special assessment because we're putting gas lights in Old Arlington, or Muirfield one day decides to put in sidewalks, and there would be a special assessment that they would be paying for over a set amount of years. So, okay. So fixtures and equipment, basically, these are all the things that we don't have to write in. And if you thought about a house, you take the house, you turn it upside down, and you shake it. If something falls out of the house, it's up for grabs, meaning the mirror that is hanging on a hook in the powder room, that's not the one that's bolted in that the builder puts up, but you went out to Pottery Barn, got a beautiful mirror, hung it up there. It's like a picture. You don't expect pictures to say. So as a buyer's agent, you want to make sure to always put all bathroom mirrors, because some of them right now they're just hanging on a hook. Anything that takes a screw to get off technically should stay on the house, stay with the house. I always write all kitchen appliances as seen on the date I was there to include stainless steel refrigerator, gas range, dishwasher, microwave, because if I don't, I could say, hey, you know what? If I just put dishwasher, range, and microwave, well, they could switch out, move to Timbuktu. And when I went through my final walkthrough, there would be a dishwasher, range, and microwave, but it would be like an old black one. You want those new, pretty stainless steel ones. So just cover yourself on that.
Tracy, something that I do, because I've run into this so many times, the media brackets, I reiterated here in this section so that they know that the media brackets are supposed to stay. Because a lot of them don't read through this list, and it's a problem after the fact because you don't realize that they don't know.
So here's the problem, children. Media brackets, pot racks in the kitchen, and swings. The swing would fall off, but you could go to your pretty house with a porch and have 4 hooks in the front porch ceiling. That'd be great. The pot hooks, the hooks would stay, but the rack would not. So if you see something like that, if you want it, say pot rack and hooks to remain, but if you don't want it, say pot rack and hooks to be removed and the ceiling patched and painted. So those are some that I've seen trouble on, and
Yeah.
definitely the TV, because a lot of houses have those. And your chances of finding a TV that fits in the bracket are hard too. So sometimes people want those taken down and then patched and painted. So just leave that one up to your buyers. So here are some things that you might not want. You know, they switched over to gas logs about 5 years ago, and right before they switched over, they had a big old wood pile on the side of their house that's just drawing termites. Have them get rid of that. Old paint cans in the basement. Oh, we left those for you. No, they just didn't want to wait in line over at Ashland to, you know, get rid of their old paint. Leased items, that could be a security system. It could be a hot water tank. Oh, and propane. Propane is a big one, guys, up here. So if you're buying a property that's a farm property, find out about that propane. First of all, you know, put the tank in there if they own it, and the propane that's included, because propane is expensive. Or if it's leased, we need to make sure that we know that as well, because a lot of those are leased.
Water softener systems too.
Water softener systems too. Good point. Okay, inspections and tests. So yes, we strongly recommend that you have a test. If you don't, right now, guys, people are so desperate to get a house that they're buying houses without home inspections. We have in our little repertoire of forms a form that says, I have told you to get an inspection and you're going against my better wishes and not doing one. So if you ever have someone buy a home without a home inspection, get that form signed. The buyer has to make has to be responsible if there are any damages that happen during the home inspection. The seller has to make the home available to have the inspection performed. Inspection period, I mean, that could be shorter. If I was in a multiple offer situation, man, I'd have that real tighten up. That would be an average 10 days. But if I'm in a pinch, I'd have that done in 5 days. So we have 10 days to have the inspection performed. And what we can have performed during that time are all of these tests. This is called the inspection, what is it? Specific inspection period, okay? And those number of days cannot be changed or modified unless in writing. So we're gonna have a home inspection, a radon inspection. We could have a mold inspection, lead-based paint, gas line inspection, lead-based paint, did I say that? Water treatment system, determination, a need for the federal flood insurance. That's a new line on this, guys. And a confirmation of insurance. That's called a clue report. I got this one, Joan. Comprehensive loss underwriting exchange. And what that means is if a house has had claims made on it, maybe the bathroom commode keeps overflowing and they've called in a claim. Well, I might want to do that know that if I was a buyer. So that when I had my home inspection, I'd say, hey, Mr. Home Inspector, really check out that upstairs bathroom. They'd have a couple claims on that. This is something that we do not, you know, get involved in. Mr. Buyer, you're going to talk to your insurance agent and say, hey, could you pull a clue report for me? You know, sometimes they pull clue reports and there was supposed to be a new roof on that house and there's no new roof. So it's like, there might have been some insurance fraud. So a clue report literally gives you a clue into what claims have been made on that house. It's a really good thing to do.
Tracy, have you had to do that yourself if your buyer does not? Is that something that you do?
No, I leave that up to them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Who does the buyer, what insurance company does the buyer get it from? From the seller's insurance company?
They have to get new home insurance anyway. So when they're talking to them about procuring the home insurance, they would just say, hey, can you run a clue report for me?
Okay.
Okay. This is all about lead-based paint. we're going to give them, if we know the house has lead-based paint, they're going to sign the waiver. They're going to know that it is. They're going to have the pamphlet on lead-based paint so that they're aware that there could be lead-based paint there. So now 6.4, we're going to go on two paths. We're either happy or we're not. So if the buyer is not satisfied with the condition, they can do one of two things. The first one is the agreement to remedy, request a remedy period. And it says on or before the end of the inspection period, right there. So we have, here's our inspection period. We have 10 days, and then we have 5 days for the request to remedy, okay? So if the number of 5 days after the end of the inspection period to negotiate like some things that we may want to have completed, all right? You do not have 15 days to get the request to remedy in. You have to terminate it on or before this, and you have to send your request to remedy on or before the 10 days. If you don't, then you don't get the chance to do your request to remedy. If I miscount and I didn't do my timeline and I was like, oh crap, I have to send the request to remedy and I missed my 10 days by 1 day, the listing agent and the sellers have no responsibility to get back to you and say, yeah, we'll take care of that or negotiate for that. So be careful on counting on those days because the buyers are going to be very upset with you. So we have 5 days to do the request of remedy where we come to terms, okay? And it says here that in the event the buyer and the seller do not reach a written agreement regarding the remedying of unsatisfactory conditions within this agreement period, guess what? Your contract is over. It terminates, okay? It says, okay, so if you don't reach an agreement and the buyer and seller have not executed a written extension of this time, the agreement to remedy, this contract shall terminate. So whatever you do, if you go, you're going to terminate here after your 10 days. If you decide to do the request of remedy, then you have to come to terms on what, things are going to be repaired. And if you don't, you've got one of two things to do. Let's look at that. You can either send a extension for more time, or you can buy the house basically as is. Nope. So it says here, and this is it's exactly the same verbiage. So under our request of remedy, we're going to say the buyer requests these things. And maybe we have 6 things here and we want to be specific. Don't just say change the wax seal in the powder room. You can, but then Uncle Joe, who's done it a couple times, is going to change that wax seal. If you want a certified plumber, write certified plumber to, repair wax seal in powder room, or certified HVAC contractor to look at the heat exchanger, whatever it is, be very specific. I always add here all repairs to be completed by final walkthrough. I lost $25 on a bet because I said in this buyer's request of remedy, I know it says that there's a date that it has to be done by. There is no date, guys. There's no date, which I find very strange. So always, always, always be specific on what you want and always write on there the dates or the all repairs and receipt of work to be completed by final walkthrough.
Tracy, I always do like 5 days prior to close, because in case something happens and we don't receive stuff by final walkthrough, they only have 2 days to pull it together. So I do 5 just to give ourselves some time.
That's a great idea. Because here's what happens if you don't, we have to come together. So what happens if you don't hear from the other agent and you've sent the buyer request? Well, it could mean that the other agent's just loosey-goosey, or the other agent's on vacation, or the other agent has a backup offer that he wants this thing to fall apart.
Mm-hmm.
So if the other agent, I would be sending, calls and texts. But if I got to midnight on the end of my 5 days and I had not heard, I would go to the buyer and say, Mr. Mrs. Buyer, I don't know what's going on. I have called, I have texted, I have sent smoke signals, and I cannot get an answer. I've called their broker. It's dead silence. You have a decision to make. You can either waive this request to remedy and say, you know what, we're tearing it up and we're going forward. And that's on another page, but there's a form for that. Say, you know what, just kidding, we'll buy the house as is. Or you can just gamble that he's a loosey-goosey agent. But I sure as heck wouldn't take that gamble. If you want this house, we need to waive it. Now, if they're not going to buy the house because they don't like what's on here, that's okay. It'll fall apart. But that's a decision that we can't let those 5 days go by and not have some resolution. You have to have a resolution.
And Tracy, that's a tactic that listing agents use sometimes to get out of a contract with a buyer that they're not, or like if they come with a laundry list of items and they don't want to negotiate, they just want to terminate. That's a way that the seller can terminate the contract.
Sure is.
Okay.
So our step one is, okay, we're going to try and do the request to remedy and say, hey, of these 5 things, you know, I'll do 3. No, come on, do that or one. And you go back and forth. It's worse than negotiating a purchase contract, actually.
It
So
is.
go back and kind of renegotiate everything that needs to be done. Now, if I don't want to do the stuff, could I take a credit for this? Yes, if you do it legally. So what does that mean? Well, if I can't credit people money anymore. So what would happen on that is maybe the sellers would do one of 2 things. They could reduce the price of the house, or they could contribute to the buyer's closing cost. But it has to be on the HUD statement, whatever it is, because you can't give money to a buyer from a seller. That's a big no-no. Can't do it. Can't do it. Unless the lender agrees that it can be done, but it's usually in the form of closing costs. Okay, so we just went through this. Okay, I love this paragraph. So let's say the buyer sends a request to remedy, and Mr. Seller's like, let's just let him sit on this because, you know, we didn't really like the negotiating that went on. And it says here, the delivery of the buyer of a written request to remedy of any unsatisfactory conditions does not preclude the buyer from later delivering a notice of termination. So Mr. Buyer could send the request to remedy on day 1, okay? And he could, Mr. Seller goes, you know what, let's let him wait till day 5. But then a new listing comes up and it's the perfect house, better than the one they're writing on. Mr. Buyer can write at any time a termination of the contract because of the inspection, even if we're in this request to remedy. So that's an important paragraph that you might want to say to Mr. Seller, guys, let's go, let's get this wrapped up, let's say what we're going to do. Do not dilly-dally around because of that paragraph, okay? Okay, so now the other thing that we can do is Mr. Buyer has a home inspection, the walls are caving in the basement, and guess what? We want out. You can do that. So we find out that, you know, it's not the house for us. Within this time period, we would deliver our notice of termination, okay? This gets a little tricky, but it's within the inspection period. So along with this, as well as the agreement to remedy, we also have to send a copy of the inspections and/or test. So you can't just say, hey, here's what it, you know, I want a new, you know, well. Well, why do you want a new well? Well, here's why. So you have to show that. Once again, earnest money shall be returned.
So Tracy, real quick, just for clarification, can you scroll up? Sorry.
Yep.
6.4A and then 6.4B.
Yep.
6.4A, that other, no, I'm sorry, scroll down. The other paragraph that says that they can terminate at any time. Yep. They can because 6.4B says within the specified inspection period, but that one above says anytime during.
It
up
says
to the re-
it says anytime during until the seller has signed. So yes, they want you to send it before the inspection period, but let's just say we go ahead and send the request to remedy. Then we get cold feet on that house and it says the delivery, it doesn't preclude me from not later sending that notice of termination as long as the seller haven't reached a signed agreement. So if Mr. Buyer have reached a signed agreement, like let's wrap it up, let's get it done, they can't get out and they're going to take the house with the repairs being done. But let's just say on day 2 of our 5 days of the request to remedy, I decide I don't want that house, I can terminate. And
Yeah.
I totally agree. That is rather confusing because it says here I can terminate anytime before they sign, and right here it says it has to be within the inspection period.
Yeah.
It's a little tricky.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
I just want to make sure I understood that correctly.
Right. Okay, warranties. This is basically if we like America's Preferred. I always try and get this with the seller in place because it's just a no-brainer, guys. If you're listing homes and not getting America's Preferred on it or whatever you use, most of those companies, you can use it. You don't have to pay for it until closing. And even if they didn't choose that one, let's just say Mr. Buyer really wanted ABC, I could have still used America Preferred, got the discounted rate with just the deductible, and never had to pay for the warranty itself. So I think it's really wise to get those, in place when you list a house. But let's just say Mr. Seller is going to pay for a different one. They want America's Preferred. All of these companies also include the gas line. So you really don't need to have a gas line protection because it's included in your home warranty.
Tracy, do you submit as a listing agent, when you get a request to remedy, do you submit it to the home warranty company and see if things are covered?
If I've already got it in place, I sure do.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why we put it in place, because if I have the home inspection and I've got a leaky faucet, America's Preferred will come out and fix it.
Right.
Something that little. Okay, so here's where it gets a little blurry. Ugh, hate these next ones. Deed. Okay, so Mr. Seller has to convey to the buyer a deed that is marketable, fee simple, and transferable. There can't be any clouds. There can't be any encumbrances. It has to be free and clear, okay? Except for those created by the buyer, those specifically set forth in this contract, zoning ordinances, legal highways, we can't move those, covenants, restrictions, conditions of easements, like we've got water in the front and we've probably got electric in the back. So those are things of record that we really can't control. This has to do with oil and gas and mineral rights. Around here, we don't have any. If you would be selling on the east side of Ohio, you might get into this where there would be mineral and coal and gas rights. Title insurance, the seller is going to provide the Alta homeowners policy. So right now in multiple offer situations, I'm seeing buyers that are willing to pay for this as a way to, help Mr. Seller out and, get a favorable opinion on their purchase contract. So that's something that either one can pay for. However, in our contract, Mr. Seller is going to furnish that. The Alta we used to have what's called an Eagle policy, and it was like the top of the line one. That's what our Alta is. So this changed about, I want to say 10 years ago to the Alta. So if anybody wants to know, I guess I should Google that too and find out what Alta stands for, but it's the better policy.
It's American Land Title Agency, something like that.
Thank you. So they have to provide that. They have to provide it within 30 days, or they have to show evidence of title 30 days prior to the closing with an endorsement at 8 a.m. on the day of closing. The seller shall deliver or cause to be delivered. See, I love that. If they had done that, buyer shall deliver or cause to be delivered, then we wouldn't have that stupid form that says, Mr. Buyer, I'm going to do it for you. Or cause to be delivered means that we're doing it for them. So we're safe on that one. But he didn't use that on all of them. To the buyer, a copy of the commitment, paragraph 9.1, no later than 15 days prior. So this is really the only paragraph where Mr. Seller's on a timeline. I mean, sure, we're watching the timeline for the buyer's actions, but this is an action that Mr. Seller has to do. So if you're working with a good title company, they're automatically going to have that taken care of. But as a listing agent, we always want to have that marked on our calendars. Oh my goodness, I want to make sure that my title commitment has been sent to the other agent. Because if the seller does not deliver the commitment within our 15-day, buyer may, by delivering written notice to the seller, either terminate this contract or extend the date. So that could get you into some hot water if you're the listing agent and didn't watch those 15 days. You new agents out there having like panic attacks going, I didn't know I had to be on top of so many dates. It's okay. Okay, so this is if the buyer gets the title commitment back and they object to part of it. So let's just say, hey, we didn't know there was an easement on our property that goes right down the side of it to get to the Verizon cell tower in the back. Well, if they didn't know about it, they have to disclose that. So once they do the title commitment, including without limitation, all matters listed in 8.1 through 8.c, which were all like these, those created zoning ordinances. So we know those are going to be there, but this is something new and different. Buyer must notify the seller or the seller's broker in writing of the objection. They say, hey, I don't want that easement, so that they can go back to the cell tower. And they have to give that objection either earlier than closing date, duh, or 10 days after the buyer receives the commitment. Okay, so they get it. They see that there's this easement. The seller then has 30 days to remove it. Well, he can't remove probably the Verizon cell tower because he's probably getting paid for that, to have that easement through there. But let's just say it's a neighbor that has an easement to get to a fishing pond that's on the back of that property. Well, he could either get rid of the easement, but really Mr. Seller doesn't have to do anything if he doesn't want to. And it says the seller shall have the option to either cure the objection at the seller's expense or to terminate the contract by delivering the written notice of termination to the buyer. So Mr. Seller can work to get that easement taken care of, but it's kind of both sides are going to be working on this. Upon termination, of course, the earnest money is going to go back. So really, if you find a easement that you weren't aware of, 30 days to get rid of it. If Mr. Seller and you don't agree on the cure to get rid of the easement, then the contract can be terminated. This is PMI. If required by the buyer's lender, the buyer has to pay for the expense for PMI and a current survey. The seller has to sign and deliver to the buyer a title insurance, an affidavit with respect to off-matter title matters in accordance to community customs. A lot of times, it's not always the seller who pays for title insurance. If you are moving to Dayton, you pay for it here as a seller, and then you buy it in Dayton as the buyer. So different community customs they vary. This is really more to do with rental, security deposits, condominiums, and a seller has to pay all accrued utility charges. Guys, remember, as we talk about utility charges, water bills are the only utilities that go with the house, not the person. So if somebody didn't shut off their utilities or had a big old utility bill and they didn't pay it, then they would go after the person. But if you bought a house, closed on it, there was a water bill that hadn't been paid. I know there was one in this office that was $820. Guess what happened? The buyers had to pay for it after closing. So you want to make sure on the water bills that's being checked, that's all been paid. And that
the title company normally does that though, right?
Absolutely. Okay. Security deposits, if it's an apartment building and you're buying the whole apartment building, the security deposits would be transferred to the buyer. Any fees, this is contributions for, oh no, this isn't. Is this the one that's the condos?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Any fees, reserves, contractual contributions, delivery statement fees for the condominiums, those are paid by the seller. And those can get expensive, you guys. They can be like ridiculous amounts to change people in a condominium, like $750, but those are all paid by the seller. Okay. So damage and destruction to property. It's strongly recommended that upon discovery of damage or destruction of the premise, all parties retain legal counsel. This is a big guy. So if any part of the premise is covered by this contract shall be substantially damaged or destroyed from the date of written acceptance, the seller shall give a written notice to the buyer that the damage has resulted. Such notice must include all pertinent information, insurance policies, and claims that have been damaged or destroyed, including the amount of the applicable policy deduction. The written notice shall be delivered within 2 days. I've got a house, tree falls on the middle of the house. I find out about it as the seller, and I have to deliver within 2 days all of that information. And the buyer has one of three things they can do. They can agree to extend the closing to find out what it's going to take to get that tree out of the middle of the house, or they can go ahead and accept the premise in the damaged condition. Say, we'll buy the house with the tree in the middle of it. We're just going to fix it ourselves. Or they can terminate the contract. Failure by the buyer to notify the seller within, in writing within 10 calendar days. So the seller doesn't do this from the receipt of the notice of the damage that the buyer is electing to proceed shall constitute that the buyer is going to terminate the contract. So you've got to be careful. I mean, like a lot of times there'll be a broken window. Does a broken window mean a substantially damaged? I mean, this gets a little tricky in there, but it would still be damage to the property, and you would still want to go through these 3 steps and say, look, we'll take the house, but negotiate for the broken window. Now, if the buyer finds the damage, failure by the seller to provide the written notice to the buyer and or buyer's broker shall result in the buyer, upon discovery of the damage, having all rights set forth in 11.2. So they also have one of these 3 options, but the seller wouldn't find the tree in the house because they don't live there. It's a vacant home.
Gotcha.
All right, earnest money, here we come. So earnest money deposit. Let's just say it's $1,000. We have 2 options when we're going to give it to them. If I'm in a multiple offer situation, I'm going to give it to them at the time I accept that purchase contract. Right then and there, we're going to give it to them, or 3 days after it's accepted. Or I could give the earnest money, that $1,000, 3 days after we've done the home inspection and done the request to remedy. Because most of the time, a deal falls apart during the inspection period. So that's just like, rather than me have to write the check and then try and get it back and do all that, I'm just going to go ahead and give it. I'm not going to give it to you so I don't have to worry about getting it back. Like I said, if I'm in a multiple offer situation, boy, I'm going to take option A in a heartbeat and say, I am in this, Mr. Seller. Okay. So within our 3 calendar days of receipt of the earnest money, the buyer or the buyer's broker shall notify the seller in writing that the buyer has made formal loan application. So we have a form for that, guys, and you have to send it in. If I send the earnest money at the exact same time that I'm sending the contract, I will fill out this box, okay? But typically we get in contract and then we either have it 3 days after acceptance or 3 days after the expiration of the request to remedy. That makes sense? But you've got to send in that form.
So sending in page, what is this? Page
This is page
9. Yes. Page 9 after the fact is a breach of this contract, right? Well, it's not a breach, but it's like you're changing the terms.
It's not a breach. As one attorney told me, this is really more for your records. The form that you really should use.
It's notification of deposit.
Right. I swear I put that one in there too. I guess there it is. Oh, I think that's just, oh no, this is the addendum. Okay, well, we might as well look at this. So right now with COVID-19 going on, instead of collecting earnest money, and for the closing, so we get the earnest money from the buyer, we send it in to Lisa, and then Lisa does her thing. Then rather than her writing back a check, us taking the check to the closing, some of us aren't going to closing, some of us are, and then doing all that transfer, we're basically just saying, hey, Mr. Buyer, the $1,500 earnest money is going to show up on as a credit on the HUD statement to you. And then we're basically going to take that money that is coming to you out of your agent's commission. And then what Lisa does is she takes the earnest money commission and just the general office commission, and she just transfers that money into your account. So you're made whole. It's just, rather than doing the check, she's just taking it from the trust account to the commission account. Okay? So you'll probably see this. This is the way Coldwell Banker has been doing it for years.
Do you always do an addendum for that, or do you just add it as additional terms and conditions?
Either way.
Okay.
Either way. That was an additional, that was on an, it could be either way. Either way. So let's say we want to terminate a contract, and I'm back at the request a remedy, and I was in my first 10 days, and I'm like, you know what, this house is just not for me. Either the attorney didn't like it, I couldn't get my loan, the appraisal came in low, my home inspection came out crappy, damage or destruction to property, whatever the case may be. I can send buyer's notice of termination as long as I'm within the dates that they were all due. And I've got my accepted date in here, and we're going to follow that timeline. Buyers and sellers have a notice of termination too. This is the only form that we have in all of our forms at CBR that only requires one signature.
Mm-hmm.
So it only takes one signature to terminate a contract. So I can terminate a contract, I can put the house back on the market, I can go buy another house simply by sending this form. Now, earnest money is a different story, because let's go to earnest money. Well, yeah, let's go there. So now our earnest money, okay. So earnest money, yes. When we collect the earnest money, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, don't give me a bad check, because it is deposited, and it's deposited into our broker's trust account. And our broker's trust account is watched like a hawk. Every brokerage, that's the biggest thing that we have to take care of. Money going in, money going out, and that's governed by the state. It's hugely important that that is taken care of. So, where were we? Within 3, okay. Okay, so we were right there. So we have that form. So if the seller or the seller's broker does not receive this earnest money within 3 calendar days, once again, they go through 3.3 where they get a second chance. And we give them a second chance by sending the deposit notice for demand, and they have another 3 days to get it to us. If the seller does not receive that deposit notice within 3 days after we've sent that demand, buyer will be in breach of this contract, and the seller may at any time thereafter, until the deposit has been delivered, terminate the contract. So they could deliver it, or they could terminate it on day 3 when they don't get it. So we've sent it, we've waited 3 days, we didn't get it, you're out, the backup offer is in. Or they could still stay in contract with you, but they could terminate it at any time until you send it. So, and for us as agents, if we know that the earnest money isn't here, okay, like if we need to like sound the alarms. So if I'm in a deal with Joan, and my buyer said he would put it in the mail, and I'm supposed to receive it on day 3, and I still don't have it, I'm going to, in writing to Joan in an email, say, Joan, My buyer said he put it in the mail. It's coming from California. I do not have it yet. And that's a paper trail that the division would watch. And I have to be forward with that. And then I would be on the phone. I'd be trying to get that. But you have to let that other agent know. You don't want to just sit on your side and just be mute. Because Joan on her side, if she didn't get it, she's watching her timeline and say, hey, Trace, I didn't get that, the earnest money or the notice that you have the earnest money. So she would send me the notice demand. The bottom line is there has to be communication and there has to be a paper trail on earnest money. So whether you have it or not, you have to let everybody know.
Question, Tracy.
Mm-hmm.
The 3 days does not start unless the deposit notice demand is delivered.
Correct.
If there's no deposit notice demand delivered and the buyer has not given the earnest money, you as the listing agent can terminate the contract because there's been no earnest money on like day 4.
No, you have to send the second chance letter, then wait 3 days.
Okay, you have to do that in order to execute that.
That's right.
Gotcha. Okay.
Which to me makes me want to pull my hair out because I'm like, really?
Right.
I'm giving them a chance and I've got a hot backup offer behind me. You have to do it.
What if the listing agent does not send on day 4, does not send the deposit notice demand, right, and still accepts the earnest money thereafter? Like the buyer's agent is late giving it to you.
I'm with you.
You never sent the demand.
And they did send it to you like on day 4 or 5 or 6.
Yeah.
You're still in contract.
You're still in contract. Okay.
Because it's the onus of the listing agent who hasn't gotten notice that you've received it to send that notice of demand. And once you send that notice of demand, the clock's ticking.
Okay.
For 3 days, and then you can get out of that contract.
Okay. So if they don't send the deposit notice demand and the buyer's agent never sends the earnest money, then what?
Then it's just in no man's land. But
Right.
that never happened because, I mean, that's one thing that we all have to watch. I mean, you're going to watch those 3 days, and
So I guess I'm saying, like, when is it appropriate or when is it okay for either side to terminate based on earnest money
you can
not being collected?
Okay, you can terminate 3 days after you send the deposit notice demand.
And if that isn't sent,
You can. But why wouldn't you? I mean, you could. You just send the letter, and then you're, because they're breach.
yeah, okay.
Okay, buyer will be in breach of this contract and seller may at any time thereafter until the deposit notice has been delivered. So it has to be delivered. So that's the job of the listing agent who hasn't received that earnest money yet, but you can't terminate. It's time thereafter the deposit notice has been delivered. I know this is a tough one.
Okay.
So tell them that the earnest money is going to go into a trust account. Yes, we're going to cash your check. Now here's where it gets tricky, guys. This paragraph right here is written by the division. All the other paragraphs in here are written by CBA. This is where it doesn't really jive together. And this is why I've been saying your people may get their earnest money back. So it says here, and this sounds so good in the beginning, if any written contingency is not satisfied or waived, or if the seller fails or refuses to perform, or if the buyer terminates this contract pursuant to any of its applicable provisions, all earnest money deposited shall be returned to the buyer. Mr. Buyer's very happy. He's like, so if my home inspection turns out, or I don't get my loan, or there's damage or destruction of the property, I get my earnest money back, right? You're like, well, yeah, it says so, but let's keep reading. If the buyer fails or refuses to perform, so the buyer gets cold feet, and he's like, I don't want this house. The earnest money deposited hereunder shall be paid to the seller. Oh, so I lose my earnest money if I don't perform. Yes, that's what it says. In any event, except as provided in 3.3, which is like, I need to go back and go through that. Under the second chance, when you, well, we'll go back there in just a minute. and except in paragraph 3.3, and the subject to collection by the broker's depository, all earnest money deposited must be distributed as follows. So it's kind of like going from good to bad. Hey, the transaction closes, the broker disperses the earnest money deposited here to the buyer, and the closing or escrow agent can be applied to the purchase price. Great, it closed, everything's hunky-dory, and you took my earnest money and applied it to the purchase contract. Great. Uh-oh, something happened. The parties provide the broker with written instructions that both parties have signed, okay? The written instructions is a mutual release that both parties have signed that specify how the broker is to disperse the earnest money deposited hereunder, and the broker acts pursuant to those, okay? Now it gets even worse. The broker receives a copy of the final court order. So now they've gone to court for this. That specifies who the earnest money is going to go to. And then finally, all earnest money deposited hereunder becomes unclaimed funds. So if it's unclaimed funds, then we have to wait 2 years. And after 2 years, the money will go back to the buyer. So it says in here, in the event of a dispute between the buyer and the seller, so we can't come to terms on the mutual agreement regarding the disbursement of earnest money, the broker is required by law to maintain such funds. You have to keep it in our trust account until our broker receives one of two things: written instructions, mutual release, signed by the parties, both parties, specifying how the money is going to be dispersed, or they've gone to court and we have a final court order. If within 2 years of the date the earnest money was deposited in the broker's trust account, the parties have not provided either or, then the broker shall return the earnest money to the buyer with no further notice to the seller. So yes, we say in here 6 or 7 times, you're going to get your earnest money back. You're going to get your earnest money back. You're going to get your earnest money back. You may or you may not, because here's what happens. House has a home inspection and they do a radon test, and the radon test comes out at 4.1. And Mr. Buyer says, I don't want the house. And Mr. Seller says, but we'll litigate. It's 4.1. This is ridiculous. You just want out of the contract. And Mr. Buyer says, nope, I want out. The buyer sends the termination with his one signature on it, and then he sends the mutual release. And Mr. Seller says, I'm not signing it. And the broker can't release the money, because it basically says here that this is the buyer and the seller, and they went into contract, and we are doing a mutual release. And this mutual release, guys, this is a great form, because even if you send a termination, there's always like, well, could they come back and sue us? A lot of people send a termination and a mutual release because this alleviates that thought of like, oh my God, could the seller come back on us? Because it says the undersigned parties for themselves, their agents, their assigns, and their representatives hereby release and discharge all of the other parties to this mutual release, along with their agents, their assigns, their representatives, from any claims, cause of action, or demands arising to the or related to the contract. The parties agree that the deposit of $1,000 now held by Keller Williams Consultants is to be released to Coldwell Banker. So this form allows our broker and to release the earnest money, but we can't release the earnest money until this puppy is sent and signed, or you have a court order. Make sense, guys? Okay, I'm going to take that as a yes. Now, 3.3 is different. How did I miss this? Okay. So, if we use a demand for financing evidence, which is basically saying, hey, you need to give me proof that you either have a lender or you've applied for your loan, okay? And they don't do that. Okay, so let's read this. If the seller does not receive the required financing evidence within 3 calendar days after the delivery of the demand for financing, seller may at any time thereafter until the financing evidence has been received terminate this contract by delivering written notice of termination to the buyer or the buyer's broker, at which time the earnest money shall be released to the buyer. Seller's election to terminate pursuant to this paragraph 3.3 is sole legal remedy for the buyer's failure to deliver the financing evidence and acts to bar any additional legal or equitable claims that the seller may have against the buyer, and constitutes the seller's consent to release the earnest money deposit. So basically it's saying, if you're getting out of the contract after the demand letter has been sent, then Mr. Seller, you can't go back and sue them, because they're trying to alleviate all of the like suing that's going on over like, well, he didn't send that in time. So they're saying, if you want to get your house back on the market, put the sign back in the front yard, then go ahead and use the demand for financing. But if you send the demand for financing, you can't go back and sue them. Okay? I'm going to take that as a yes.
Tracy, I have to go. I have a 3:30 call.
Okay.
Bye. Thank
Yeah.
you.
All right, we're almost done, guys. Okay, there's a really important paragraph I want to star. This one right here. Okay, so except as provided in 3.3, which is the one we just read, okay? The return or the payment of the earnest money deposit hereunder shall in no way prejudice the rights of the seller, the buyer, or the broker in any action for damages or specific performance. So what does that mean? That means that when you sit down with your buyer, you're going to say, hey, you're not buying a pair of shoes. This is a house. So this is very important. So what that means is we're writing a contract. Let's say you go out and you find another house that you like better and you just get cold feet and you don't want this house any longer. And you say, let them keep the earnest money. I just want out. I'm just going to get out. They can come after me, but they, let the mutual release, take care of it, and they can keep the earnest money. But it says here that the payment of the earnest money, okay, Mr. Buyer, you're going to lose your $1,000 earnest money because you got cold feet. It in no way prejudices the rights of the seller for them to come back and sue you for specific performance or damage. So they could take your $1,000 earnest money, turn around and say, we're suing you for specific performance. And specific performance is, if I sold a house and let's just say I sell it in November, it's been on the market for a long time. It's a more expensive home and it's on the market and it's $700,000. Finally, I get it in contract. You go through about a month or two later and you're like, you know what? We were supposed to close mid-December, but I don't want this house anymore. I just don't want it. Keep the earnest money. I'm out of here. Now, Mr. Seller can say, that's fine. We'll take your earnest money. But if that house sells, let's say it goes back on the market in December, we have a hard winter, there's no sales in December, January, February. So it finally gets sold and it sells for $600,000 in March. Mr. Buyer, who booked on the first contract, can be sued for the difference of what it was in contract for and what it finally sold for, which on that little scenario was $100,000. So it's a big deal. Buyers could get sued too, sellers could get sued too, that if they got cold feet and wouldn't sell the house, specific performance on theirs is the buyer couldn't find a house that sat on the lot facing the right direction and the sun came in and that morning light, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes with it. Not as common as a buyer selling for specific performance. Or seller, I'm sorry, selling, or a seller suing for specific performance. That's a lot of S's. Any questions on specific performance? Okay. All right, so this is the entire contract. There's nothing that has, like, we just got like, oh yeah, this page is, we didn't, really include that. It all has to go together. Time is of the essence. That's a legal, heavy legal term, meaning that if we say it's 5 days or 3 days, it is, and that we have to make sure. And if it's going to be modified or waived, it has to be in writing by both parties. All representations, covenants, and warranties of the parties contained in this contract shall survive the closing. So that's like your home warranties, any covenants, conditions of easement, those are all going to survive the closing. Broker and agent are kind of simultaneously used in this contract, and they mean for both of us. If they use the term broker, it means us as agents as well. They're always calendar days. They are not business days in our purchase contract. All signatures work, manual, electronic, dot loop, PDF, faxes, you name it, they work. Okay, this is an important one. So the date of acceptance of this contract, counteroffers, amendments, modifications shall be when the final writing signed by both parties is delivered, not opened. I could deliver something, but if Mr. Seller doesn't open it for 5 days, well, he's kind of missed the boat. But I have to show proof on the date that I delivered it. If I had a 10 p.m. deadline and I sent it at 9:59, it was delivered, I made my deadline. Oh yeah. Oh, this is just common courtesy, guys. When you ever send a purchase contract, always text and call and say, hey, I just sent you a purchase contract. I mean, sometimes if they don't do that, and you're like, whoa, I've got a contract or something. Just always give them the heads up. That's just courtesy. Okay, so this is the FERPA. FERPA is if you have a seller who is a foreign person. So if your seller is foreign and they are not a US citizen, then they would not pay taxes, okay? So the buyer, if they're buying a home of a foreign person, then the buyer, they withhold 15% of the net proceeds are realized by the seller on the transfer and remit the withheld amount to the Internal Revenue Service. So let's just, what does that mean? If I sold a house and my net proceeds were $20,000, the buyer withholds, it's actually the IRS withholds, $3,000, and it's checked for tax evasion. So it goes to the IRS. They make sure that there's taxes being paid on that, and the government gets their money for the tax of the transaction. Okay, notices to the party. I love this. We acknowledge that the broker possesses considerable general knowledge. We don't know jack as far as law, tax, financing, servicing, structural conditions. We don't know anything. I love that. And the buyer hereby advises the parties and the parties acknowledge that they should seek expert professional assistance. So even if we give them names or anything, such as advice and assistance, that the broker does not warrant, guarantee, or endorse those. That's kind of a CYA for us. Our fair housing kicks into play. Of course, we cannot discriminate against any of the protected classes when dealing with real estate. Our residential property disclosure form, that has to be filled out, obviously. And so it has to be, the buyer is entitled to rescind this agreement by delivering a document of rescission to the seller or to the seller's broker, provided such document of rescission is delivered prior to all 3 of these dates. 1, the date of closing. Yes, if we haven't received the RPD by the time we close, you can rescind the offer. B, 30 days after it's been accepted. So 30 days go by and you still don't have that RPD, you can get out of the contract. And C, within 3 days getting it and you read it and you don't want it, then you can rescind the offer as well. Sex offender, this is very important to have your buyers get on to the sheriff's website and check to see if there's sex offenders. I always tell my buyers there's going to be a bunch of them, and there's always a bunch of them. So, but you want them to acknowledge that they know, and that they, I mean, I sometimes do it with them. It's like, come on, let's jump on, because I don't want them to not know where there's a sex offender living. This is a new paragraph. The buyer and the seller authorized the broker to report sales and financing concessions to the MLS, researching companies as well, and appraisers. So that if an appraiser is doing an appraisal and they see that your house sold for, maybe less than what the comps are coming at, they may call you and say, hey, did you pay for closing costs? Because typically, it's a deduction in the sales price. So we're going to have closing. We're going to fill that in. And we're going to have final verification of condition. That's our final walkthrough. And this is one that when I teach this class, if I'm in person, I make everybody raise their right hand and promise me, yes, you have 2 days to do your final walkthrough. And what typically happens is our closings on Friday, you're going to go through Thursday night with your buyers, and then you're going to get up the next morning, go to the closing and close. I want you to always go, if you have a vacant home, only if it's vacant, you go that morning before the closing, because you never know what happens overnight. We had a closing in this office, and the buyers, they did that exact same scenario. They closed on their house Friday after the closing. They went back to their house. It was in the short north, and all of the cabinetry, beautiful cherry cabinetry, was taken from the house. Someone broke in and took all of the cabinetry. And if that agent had just walked through that morning, I mean, literally take you 2 seconds, walk through that house, make sure there's no water in the basement, make sure a tree didn't fall on the house, and make sure your cabinetry is there, and then go to the closing. It's just a really good habit to get into. Possession, I like to say time of closing or at funding. That's always a fight. If I'm the seller, I do not want time of closing or funding. I want 3 days to get out. I've seen deals fall apart the day before closing, and now I've moved out of my house. I'm renting an apartment. I've got everything in a pod, and my house is available. So come on, Mr. Buyer, give me a couple days to get out. If I'm the buyer, it's my house. I don't really want to pay for you to be there 2 or 3 days. So it's kind of like the battle of whoever wins. But I love this one because the buyers always go, well, if we let them stay 2 or 3 days, what happens if they like mess up our house or tear off the banister when they're moving? And I say, look at 15.3. At the time the seller delivers possession, the premise will be in the same condition as the date of acceptance of this contract, normal wear and tear accepted. So it's going to be, we have a line in our contract that says it needs to be in the same condition. So that always gives them a little bit of relief. They have to have all their stuff out. Like farms, like barns are full of stuff. It's just like you want to make sure that the debris and personal property have been removed. Duration of offer, guys, that really makes a big difference on if we're in a multiple offer or not. I say if you're in a multiple offer, don't give them much time, press them. And we're going to go back to those and then fill this all out. I mean, we can always have this filled out. And all of this information is always on the nightly news. If you're unsure about what our broker license number is or our MLS office ID number is. So these 4 questions I always ask before I send a contract. I know this sounds silly, but in this day and age, we need to ask this. Is the house still available? Let's say you set it up for, you've got out-of-town clients, they're getting in on Monday through Thursday. And over the weekend, the house goes into contract. It goes in on Sunday night. And the listing agent's so excited that the house went into contract that she forgets that you're showing it on Monday morning. So you fall in love with the house, your people are in love with it. You go home, you write comps or run comps, and you write the per contract, you send it, and the agent goes, oh, that's in contract now. So is the house still available? You're also going to ask that listing agent, do you have any written offers? Of course, she's accepting offers. They're always accepting offers. Do you have anything in writing? Do you represent the other offer? They may or may not tell you this. You'll be amazed what agents will tell you. But I want to know that because I know there's a chance that the other agent could reduce her commission and I'm already in the hole. I'm already in the hole, because if she dropped to 4 and I'm at 6, there's 2% on my side. Okay. And then what's the seller's hot button? Guys, it's not always money. You know, it could be like, hey, I'm having a graduation party and I've got everything planned and you want to close that same weekend. Well, if you're sending that offer and I'm the smart agent that says, hey, you can have it, you know, keep the house and you can have possession, or let's close 2 weeks later, I'm going to win that. I'm going to win that. So, okay, questions. I know this was a long one. It is a long purchase contract. The one thing I would really suggest doing is just going through and internalizing this whole purchase contract as well as our listing contract, so that you don't have to, you know, you can paraphrase every single paragraph in here for your buyers and sellers. You have to do it for both of them.
Tracy, post-closing possession.
Yep. Well, I have we use a, I think it's in all of our templates actually. Hang on. We have a post-closing and possession. Hang on, let me see where that is. You're in my way.
Sorry, my cats are talking to
I can hear them. So if we go to templates and then we go down to clauses, and I want to say we have one, FHA, final walkthrough, backup, counteroffer, release, escape. Maybe it's just in mine. This is the one for the company. But post-closing basically says, hey, you're either going to pay rent. I say pay rent after 5 days, unless I'm in a multiple offer situation. I can say, just stay to your little heart's content. Tax, seller's tax. Oh, there's the tax proration clause we were talking about. Inspector clause. Signatures, addendum A. Addendum A, remember that if you have a house to sell, addendum A is the one you use for sellers. Addendum B is for buyers. And the only difference is one will accept a non-contingent offer. Yeah, your earnest money. Propane tanks, we talked about that. Post-closing possession. So here it is right here. So it's in our clauses, and it's just a good one to use that says, hey, there's going to be a per diem. And it also talks about, as far as with the seller, the seller wanting to get insurance, like renter's insurance, if they would stay a long time.
Is there anything that doesn't have anything to do with the per diems and the rent back, but just like condition and, you know, making sure that they actually move out?
Yeah, well, it says here, it says it has to be in the same condition. Hang on, I'm going to move you. Same condition as the date of closing. Seller shall be responsible for lawn, landscaping, maintenance, mowing, weeding, watering, blah, 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 blah. I mean, you could add, I mean, all of these have been written by attorneys so that we're not really practicing law, but I mean, if you added something on there, you could do that.
Yeah.
Is the per diem typically you take your mortgage and divide it by 30, or how, or is there no standard?
The buyers are going to take their PITI. So let's just say it's $1,000,
Okay.
and then divide by 30. So yeah. Or the other way you could look at that is, what's it going to cost them to, I mean, they're not going to pay for their PITI probably until like a month and a half down the road. So
Right.
they could say, we're staying in a extended stay and it's $200 a week. So you could say whatever that is too.
Right. Everything's negotiable.
And dog must like yard. That's a very important one. I did that for a joke and then it stayed in there. But it was contingent on the dog liking yard. That was. Okay. Anything else? Oh, you know what I wanted to show you guys? What was the one that wasn't there that I said, oh, it was the deposit.
The deposit notice.
There's the demand disbursement. It's right here. So this is the one that nobody does. So this is, and it's super simple, but this is instead of the, when you, after you have the loan application, 5 days after you've gone into contract, this little form needs to go back, and it just basically says, and you don't have to get signatures on it. I mean, it's just like you saying, hey, yeah, oh, this is the earnest money. I'm sorry. This is the earnest money one that you would want to send back saying, hey, I've got the earnest money. It has one signature. And then the other one we were looking for was the loan. Loan.
Loan application.
Coming up. What's that called? No. You would think it would be under loan.
Is it like choosing the lender? The
It's identification, lender identification.
mm-hmm.
Hi. There it is. Huh. And why didn't that come under lender when I wrote it? So this is the one after your loan application. And it's very similar. And it just says, yep, they've made formal loan application or will, and then you just sign, the buyer sign it.
So that's their agent's responsibility to send to you if you're the,
Yes,
Okay.
if you're the listing agent. Absolutely.
okay. Tracy, do you have an email? Like, would you mind if I would email you
Yep, I
questions?
will get that out. Yes, of course. It's tchambers@kw.com.
tchambers@kw. Okay.
Yes, call me anytime. I love our purchase contract, and I know it pretty well.
Yeah, I guess so. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
No, but there's lots of, like I said, just internalize this contract, and then you'll be a smart cookie.
Yeah. And every little tight little situation that you get in, you learn a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more.
Every time, every single.
Every deal is different. You learn a little bit more every single time. So,
So true.
yep.
Okay, guys. Well,
Thank you,
there-
Tracy. That was
Thank you. I
awesome.
appreciate it.
Oh, you betcha.
Good job.
All right.
Thanks.
See you
Bye.
guys.